Bulavinaka and greetings to everyone who's joining us this morning. It's about midday here in Fiji, and we're very grateful that you're joining us at this hour. I'd like to take this time to welcome Elder Tess. We welcome you in the name of our Father, our Lord, and the Holy Spirit. Thank you for availing yourself to be with us through the online virtual learning. We looking forward to learning whatever you have for us this today. We all gathered here inside a classroom, and it's quite cold here in Fiji, and we're looking forward. We thank you, Sister Tess, and everybody who's joining us from around the world. And we will not forget to also mention that you can hear us. Oh, yeah. Yes, that's our words of welcome here from here in Fiji, from the Isles of the Seas Ministry. And we look forward to learning in this session. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you to the Islands of the Sea Ministry. It's a real honor for us to be able to fellowship with you. I don't believe it's cold. I don't believe you. Okay. I have sent to the translators a link to an article that's not in their that the quotes that they have been given. I'm sorry it's been given at such late notice, but I will be reading from that. So if it's possible for you to find that article, it's attached. Just a little technicality. Sister Brody is sending to you directly then. We'll wait till Elder Gabriel has his quotes. There's an article by Digital History, and then there should be a Word document. That's it. Okay, so if we're ready to begin, our translators are all ready. We will kneel in prayer. Is that okay? We'll have a silent prayer to begin. Amen. So we're continuing on from yesterday. I'll do a short review. But I want to include a couple of thoughts that weren't mentioned yesterday. They shouldn't be thoughts that are new. But I just want a reminder. I'll need to erase this, so I'll just remind us first of this point. There are set periods where they can see that there was a particular development in US politics. In how political parties were structured and organized. We have the first party system, the second party system, and the third party system. They are the three that overlap with our reform land. We're particularly focusing on the second. Which was predominantly the Whig Party versus the Democrat Party. The Whig Party fell apart in the 1850s, and a branch of that became the Republican Party. So then after about 1855, you had Democrats versus Republicans. But the predecessor of the Republicans was the Whig Party. The parties switched platforms between the Civil War and the Civil Rights era. So in Millerite history, the Democrats were more on Southern interests and the Whigs and Republicans on Northern interests. Particularly early on, there was significant grey areas. But those parties became more and more polarized. Just like today. So if you're William Miller, or Samuel Snow. You're expecting the second advent to be here. So as we cover this history, you see polarization rising in particularly the 10 years prior to this history, 10, 15 years. Slavery is becoming more and more divisive. And the future of the United States hinges on the 1844 US election. This is a book by John Bicknell titled America, 1844. First quote. Miller was confident that Election Day would never take place. While among the politicians in Washington, he wrote that he planned to, and then we'll quote him, show them an important revolution will take place before long. Which will supersede the necessity of choosing a president by ballot. For the King of Kings will soon be inaugurated into the chair of state. So is William Miller particularly focused on the external political events? No. This lines up with November 9, 2019. Would we care about the external events of 2019 if Christ was coming in a matter of months? In a history of success, they should have corrected that mistake in time. What we are seeing now is largely what they should have seen. If Samuel Snow had have corrected the mistake. And then on top of that, of necessity, they must have a woman prophet who is also impeded by her own sexism. That says these external events are outside a woman's sphere of influence. So review. We started back from the beginning. We looked at the Constitution. We saw it was a compromise document. In three particular parts. One of those was a fugitive slave clause. Though they wrote it in an ambiguous way. To disguise the ugly word. But if they didn't mean slavery, they wouldn't have amended that after the Civil War. So the principle of the Fugitive Slave Act was in the Constitution. Reinforced by other laws. Finally, and particularly with the 1850 Compromise. And in 1861, the argument that the South is making in 1861, the South makes the following argument. The law and a plain reading of the Constitution is on our side. And if you want to do a plain reading, their arguments are better than that of the North. So 1798, you have a compromised constitution. Because the main priority is to hold that union together. Then 1798, Henry Clay does his first political speech. We looked at the 1818 Missouri Compromise. Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state. This wasn't accepted in the North. So Henry Clay linked the requests of two states. Missouri can enter as a slave state if Maine can enter as a free state. John Quincy Adams said the following: He said, "I take it for granted that the present question is a mere preamble. It's like the title page of a book. The title page of a great tragic volume. John Quincy Adams is the eldest son of his father, John Adams, Sr. John Adams Sr. was president in 1798. But his son also becomes president and as John Quincy Adams ages, he becomes more and more against slavery. And he says this Missouri Compromise is just the title page, just the introduction. The president thinks that the compromise will take all of this away. But he doesn't believe that. This question, this issue, is now destined to last the extent of their individual and political lives. I want to be clear in this history. It's one thing that I'm hoping we see more and more clearly. This was not a fight between slaveholders and abolitionists. To be an abolitionist was considered to be a radical extremist. What the North was involved in, what Henry Clay was involved in, was a type of abolition. But what they wanted to do was to end it slowly. They just hoped it would gradually end of itself in the South without their effort. People could be abolitionists for different reasons. The majority of people were in the center. And their position with slavery could be one of the following things. Slavery should end Because the Black population is having more and more children. Inevitably, some are freed. The races somehow mix to whatever degree. And that's a bad thing. Freed Black people might take white people's jobs. It's better for white people if slavery ended. And then the popular idea at the time they put them all back on ships and send them back to Africa. You could be against slavery for racist reasons. And this is part of the problem that the Black Lives Matter protesters are raising. Because the people that in today's warped history treats as heroes if you investigate their positions, were no heroes. But there's been a cult of personality, an invention of history wrapped around them. John Quincy Adams was one of the better ones of that history. But if you're an abolitionist in the radical sense of the word, you didn't get far in politics. So this was not anti-racists versus racists. For the most part. This was mostly just various extremes of racism. In both political parties. But the Whig, then Republican Party, led towards abolition, and the Democrat Party led towards slavery. Just as you have centrists today, and then a spectrum of left and right. Abolition being an absolute extreme position. We discussed 1798. '18 to 1820. was the Missouri Compromise. Now, 1833. I mentioned a pro-slavery extremist yesterday. John C. Calhoun. He was from South Carolina. He was a strong defender of slavery and minority states' rights. In the late 1820s, his views changed more and more radically. And the issue of slavery was very closely connected to their issues over the economy. So the economy of the North was more dependent upon manufacturing. And the South with slavery on agriculture. And the economy of the North was suffering because of cheap imported goods. If you can buy cheap manufacturing from Britain, it drives down prices of their own manufacturing. So they placed a tariff on imported manufacturing. So you pay extra to import manufactured goods. But in the South, they don't have much manufacturing. So they're importing quite a lot. And as the tariff drives up prices, it hurts their economy. And the South takes this personally. And John C. Calhoun starts spreading the ideas through the South that there should be conditions on the Southern states staying in the Union. And if the government doesn't follow through with the requests of the South, they will secede from the Union. This becomes a genuine risk in that history. September 11 of 1830, John C. Calhoun wrote a letter. He says that the tariff is the effect, not the cause of this issue. He says the truth can't be hidden any longer. It's the slavery in the South and the choices she has made in respect to industry that has placed them in this difficult position. Where their interests are being violated. Interests sacrificed, domestic institutions subordinated, themselves and children reduced to wretchedness. So the North and the South play politics in Congress. They all try to pretend that slavery doesn't exist. That that's not a root cause of their issues. John C. Calhoun is quite helpful to us. Because he had a way of cutting through the political speech and making the issues directly about slavery. He does the same thing in 1844. Whigs and Democrats are arguing about whether or not to annex Texas. And both are diplomatically pretending that this issue has nothing to do with the expansion of slavery. And Calhoun upsets the South when he goes public and says it's all about slavery. It hurt their cause because the South had less of a chance of getting that passed if the North knew it was all about slavery. But Calhoun wanted to push that to the forefront because he wanted slavery to gain the ascendancy and spread. So a compromise tariff was constructed in 1833. Proposed by, in union John C. Calhoun, and Henry Clay. And it was considered to save the Union. Also, in late 1833, Clay began to have dinners with certain opposition leaders to try and come up with a candidate to oppose Martin Van Buren in the next election. This is considered to be the birth of the Whig Party. In the 1836 election, the Whigs didn't run one candidate, they ran quite a number, multiple. To try to prevent the Democrat Party from gaining a majority. This is from that same book, America, 1844. There was another rule introduced into Congress that same year. Led by pro-slavery Democrats. It was called the gag rule. Gag as in you can't speak. What this rule made happen what they said these irritating abolitionists are sending petitions to Congress. And this subject of abolition prevents us from getting our work done. So they decided that they would not accept any petitions that talked about freeing the slaves. And every time there was a new Congress, John Quincy Adams tried to have that rule removed. But it was not successfully removed until 1844. So from 1836 to 1844, you couldn't even approach Congress on the subject of abolition. A Tennessee slaveholder led in the application of that rule. James K. Polk. He was Clay's opponent and victor in the 1844 election. He became the president that annexed Texas, took California and Oregon. But the Democrats weren't able to pass that rule alone. Whigs were involved. So for time, I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. That's the issue of 1833 between North and South. To try and make it clearer what we're doing, we're discussing three compromises. (1818 to 21). (1833 and 1850). And then a number of US elections. (1840). (1844, 1848, and 1860). We'll just discuss those ones for time. So we've discussed these two, 1818, 1833. In the 1840 election, the Whig Party is finally ready to settle on one candidate. So as I said, the Whig Party leans against slavery and the Democrat Party for slavery. So they're looking for a candidate. And one of those candidates was General Winfield Scott. He was no great hero for equality. But he had written a letter expressing sympathy for abolitionists. And someone leaks that letter to the Virginia delegation of the Whig Party. The position you might think of as reasonable. If you want to win the election, you don't want an extremist. So he is not given that candidacy. For the position of president, they choose William Henry Harrison, a nice centrist, so you can win the election. Back then, the vice president didn't do very much. It was a powerless position. So to win votes in the South, they pick a vice president who's a Southern slave owner. Many Whigs were excited with Harrison because they said there would never be another slave-holding president again. They felt they'd won against slavery with Harrison. They made the right compromises to win the election. But the boat was headed in the right direction. After 1 month in office, Harrison dies. So their victories turned to mourning by their own compromise. John Tyler was a slave-owning Southerner, barely a Whig. He quickly becomes president, and he throws out all of the Whig agenda items. This angers the party so much, they throw him out of the Whig Party while he's president. But all that he does between 1840 and 1844 is the result of their own compromise. To win more votes in the South. He's the one that brings the annexation of Texas into the public view. (1844) election. The Whig Party is finally going to nominate their own leader, Henry Clay. Against the Democrats' Polk. So by 1844, the issue of annexing Texas is a major political question. The Democrats demand it, the Whigs are against it. So Henry Clay stands against the annexation of Texas. But he wants to win Southern votes. So he writes a letter to the Southern newspapers. And he says he's not that opposed to annexing Texas, just if the conditions were right. He had some strict conditions, but he showed himself as favorable to the idea. Problem is the letter he wrote to the Southern newspapers is also read by the Northern newspapers. So the Northern Whigs who did not want to annex Texas did not want to see the expansion of slavery. They can easily, visibly see his compromise, and they're angry. He told the North one thing and the South another thing. And he loses support in his own party because of that. The other attack on him was he wasn't very religious. He wasn't very moral. Same kind of attack you'd get against a Democrat. So they chose a very religious vice president to balance that ticket. But he loses the election. There are a number of reasons he lost the election, but I'll speak of two. One, he visibly compromised in the letter he sent to the South on Texas. And the second, the fact that they had not taken a stronger position on slavery splits the vote. And staunch abolitionists vote for a third party, the Liberty Party. I'm quoting now. This is from a biography, short biography portion on Henry Clay. And it begins, it's actually going to be speaking about Polk, the winner. Polk proved to be an extraordinarily successful president. Perhaps the most underrated in history. He secured Oregon, California, Texas, and the Southwest in between. It's hard to imagine what the United States may have been without him. But the Mexican War, fought over Texas, and Polk's expansionist policies were the fuse that ignited the events that led directly to the Civil War. These waymarks on our reform line would be 2014 and 2019. Sunday law. What happened in that 1844 election led directly to 1850, led directly to 1861. Going back to the quote. The main result of the war and its huge increase in territory was to set off in Congress a sectional struggle over the expansion of slavery that shattered the political parties and eventually the Union. Some commentators later claimed that had Henry Clay been elected in 1844, there may never have been a civil war. We can't lose sight of the fact that Clay is not the bad guy in all of this. He's not the Trump, the Bannon, the McConnell. I want to be clear, I'm not making him specifically anyone. But what he symbolizes today. (1848) election. By the way, Abraham Lincoln is involved in all of this. This 1840 election was radically different to any election held before. It ran on emotional populist campaigns. They won that election, lost this one, won these. Harrison won by this cult of personality that made him a man of the people. The false idea that he lived in a log cabin was a major part of that cult of personality. Lincoln campaigned for Harrison in 1840. And if you have a picture in your mind of Lincoln and a log cabin, it's because he just stole all of that and reused it in 1860. (1848) election. The Whigs win this election. They again choose someone who they think will win over Southern votes. Zachary Taylor. But he was tired of those Southern threats. Where they say, if you don't do what we like, we're going to secede from the Union. And Zachary Taylor's position is, you try that, I'll just go to war with you and you won't win. He was quite threatening. So in 1844, they decide to annex Texas. In 1845, they go to war with Mexico over Texas. By 1846, they're looking at all three: Texas, California, Oregon. California doesn't want to be a territory. The gold rush is occurring. California is a vast area. Their population is booming. And they want to become a state. So you have the same issue in the history of 1848 to 1850 that you had in 1818. Missouri and Maine, what do you do with these new states? So California doesn't want slavery. What do you do now when you make it a state? The South says that if slavery is outlawed in these new Western states, they will secede from the Union. So the 1844 choice to rapidly expand the United States sets off this sectional crisis. And this is what the 1850 Compromise is all about. The North says, we want California as a free state. It upsets the free state, slave state balance. In steps Henry Clay. What they need is a compromise. He's deathly ill. But he throws his energy into this compromise. Zachary Taylor doesn't want this compromise. He won't sign it. Zachary Taylor dies after 18 months in office. In steps Millard Fillmore. He's a pro-business northerner. People thought he would balance the Southern Taylor. But whereas Taylor wouldn't sign the compromise, he dies in 1850. Millard Fillmore signs it. Millard Fillmore was personally opposed to slavery. As was Henry Clay. But their argument was the priority is the safety of the Union, and upholding a plain reading of the Constitution. So in 1850, to preserve the Union, a Whig president, a Whig Northern president, signs a Whig written compromise. So we're out of time, so I'm going to summarize, and then tomorrow we'll get into Abraham Lincoln. Henry Clay died in 1852. And Abraham Lincoln gave his eulogy. Eight years before he was nominated president. So we have the political life of Henry Clay from 1798 to 1852. The Great Compromiser. There's three main compromises. Missouri to preserve the Union. Missouri to preserve the Union. (1833), the Tariff Compromise to preserve the Union. (1850) to preserve the Union. He based his foundation on a plain reading of the Constitution over his personal convictions. And he prided himself on being a centrist, not a radical extremist abolitionist. He founded the Whig Party that later became the Republican Party under Lincoln. They won 2 elections. But had 4 presidents in office because both of their presidents died. In 1840, they compromised. And that turned the course of the United States. In 1844, they lost because of compromise. In 1848, again, they're trying to balance their election ticket. And the vice president signs the 1850 compromise. We've looked at those 3 compromises and 3 elections. I want us to think about how much more reasonable their position is. If you want to turn the course of America, you have to win the election. And if you want a high chance of winning that election, you want a candidate that can get enough votes. Someone that can appeal to both sides. Someone who's a centrist. Not a radical abolitionist. That way they can gradually end slavery and preserve the Union. Isn't there a place for compromise? Whatever I feel, don't the states have the freedom to choose for themselves? Shouldn't I respect their individual decisions for how to run their own states? And their right to do that is written into the Constitution. So whatever they believed about slavery, doesn't their position seem reasonable? That's why Henry Clay today is revered as a hero of his time. Someone who wasn't so stubborn he couldn't work with both sides. Someone who upheld the Constitution and the Union. You would think he was on the right side of history. But Ellen White says differently. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer and continue tomorrow morning. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for these histories. That can teach us not just the external politics of today, but also of the internal growth we are meant to be experiencing. Is there a place for individual freedoms and compromise on the truth? We pray, Lord, that we'll grow in our understanding of this history, particularly as we see the political storm growing outside of us. And as many people struggle to understand the concepts of compromise and freedom.